Welcome to week 9. This week we're diving into two important tools for policy research and evaluation, which are key informant interviews and equity analysis. These methods allow us to go beyond the numbers. They help us understand why policies look the way they do and why they're implemented, as well as who they're benefiting and maybe leaving behind. By the end of today, you should have three key takeaways. First, a deeper understanding of how to design and analyze key informant interviews, especially in the context of policy analysis, where we're often talking to stakeholders who shape, implement, or critique policy. Second, you'll become familiar with the idea of equity assessment, that is, systematically examining who gains and who loses from a given policy. And third, we'll discuss practical approaches and tools for integrating equity into your analyses, not as an afterthought, but as an essential dimension of evaluating public policy. So think of this session as building your capacity to both collect richer data and interpret that data more critically. When we talk about key informant, or sometimes we call them elite interviews, we're referring to an in-depth conversation with individuals who hold specific knowledge or influence about a policy area. Those aren't random participants, they're typically policymakers, administrators, advocates, or other actors who can offer insider perspectives on how policies are made and implemented. As the University of Washington defines it, these interviews focus on topics for which the interviewee has firsthand knowledge, and Beamer goes a bit further to highlight how they can generate unique, cost-effective data on the complexities of politics and policy. So when you're conducting a policy analysis, think of key informant interviews as a way to open the black box and to see the informal dynamics, the power struggles, the decision-making processes that often don't appear in official documents. These interviews yield qualitative, descriptive insights that can really enrich your analysis. They help you understand why actors behave the way they do, their motivations, constraints, and perceptions, and you'll often hear or learn about successes and shortcomings of policies or programs from the people directly involved. They can give you recommendations and future directions, which are especially useful when you're developing policy options or proposing reforms. Another advantage is that insights can help you interpret qualitative and quantitative data. For example, if your survey results show low policy adoption rates, interviews might reveal that it's due to a bureaucratic bottleneck of some sort, or maybe instead a lack of political will. And finally, key informant interviews often serve as preliminary groundwork for designing larger quantitative studies, which help you refine your hypothesis or identify relevant variables to measure later. Now let's situate key informant interviews within the broader policy process. And according to Patton, Sawicki, and Clark, policy analysis involves these systemic steps that you've seen before. And key informant interviews can contribute to valuable data at multiple points in this process. For example, even during the problem definition, interviews can reveal how different stakeholders frame the issue, which is often half the battle in policy debates. When assessing alternatives, these interviews can provide insights into how different groups might respond to a proposed policy. It's also useful in equity assessment and ex post evaluation, helping us understand not only what a policy did, but why it worked or did not work. In short, key informant interviews give us the qualitative glue that connects the technical analysis to the political and social realities of policymaking. Like any method, key informant interviews come with strengths and limitations. On the plus side, they allow us to gather insider knowledge from people directly involved. They often allow us to share details or perspectives that we can't find elsewhere. It gives us the opportunity to explore unanticipated ideas as they arise, which is key when analyzing complex dynamic policy environments. And practically speaking, they're relatively inexpensive and straightforward to conduct when compared to large-scale studies. But let's be mindful of some of the drawbacks. First, they're not suitable for quantitative data collection. They're inherently vulnerable to bias, both from the informant, who may present events strategically, and from the interviewer, whose tone or framing might shape the responses. Also, findings can be difficult to validate because you can't replicate the interview or ensure full objectivity, which means triangulation with other data sources is critical. When conducting key informant interviews, it's helpful to think about a four-step process. Adapted from Beamer in 2002, first you need to identify your constructs of interest. These are the ideas that are key or the variables that you want to explore. Also, design questions or prompts that capture these. For example, if you're studying political feasibility, you might ask about perceptions of stakeholder support or opposition. Second, you'll want to develop sampling procedures that maximize validity. This means choosing informants who are truly knowledgeable and representative of diverse perspectives. Third, you'll conduct the interviews ideally while collecting support or corroborating data. Such data include policy documents, meeting minutes, news coverage, and these are used to contextualize what's being said. Finally, you move into the data analysis phase, including including identifying themes, patterns, and narratives which can inform your broader policy conclusions. The key here is to keep your research purpose and your analytical framework in mind from start to finish. Next, when preparing your interview questions, the first step is to define the core concepts you want to investigate. These might include contextual factors such as the political environment or power dynamics, or they might be more specific, like attitude toward a policy option or assessment of program success. Once you have clear concepts, think carefully about who you need to talk to. The right informant depends on your research question. Legislators and agency staff might provide institutional insights, while advocates or opponents can offer perspectives on influence, legitimacy, and framing. Finally, consider what types of questions you need to tap into these constructs. You might use open-ended questions to elicit rich narratives or targeted prompts to clarify factual details. The goal is to strike a balance between depth and focus, meaning getting detailed responses without losing sight of your analytical objectives. Next, maintaining validity in qualitative interviewing requires consistency and reflexivity. This means that your questions and prompts should be presented in a consistent way to all respondents, even if the conversation is semi-structured. You'll want to avoid signaling strong opinions on the topic, as this can bias your responses. And remember that your tone as an interviewer, your body language, and personal characteristics may subtly influence how participants respond. Being aware of these dynamics and, where possible, documenting them helps preserve the credibility of your data. When selecting interview participants, Beamer outlines a few different sampling strategies that balance both internal validity and their generalizability. A single-state maximum response approach can yield deep, internally valid insights but may lack generalizability. Using multiple states with random or stratified sampling improves representativeness and comparability, but requires more resources and coordination. Finally, snowball sampling, this is where participants recommend others, can be useful for identifying hidden or hard-to-reach elites, though it carries the risk of bias if your initial contacts share similar perspectives. Ultimately, your sampling approach should align with your research purpose. Do you want to explore a case in depth, or do you want findings that can generalize across contexts? There's no one-size-fits-all. Instead, it's about the methodological fit for the question in front of you. Next, when conducting key informant interviews, ethical practice is absolutely critical and essential. The foundation for ethical conduct comes from the Belmont Report, which identifies three key principles. These are respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. Respect for persons means honoring participants' autonomy and ensuring voluntary informed consent. Beneficence reminds us to maximize potential benefits and minimize potential risks or harms. And justice ensures fairness in how research burdens and benefits are distributed. We're not overburdening vulnerable groups, for example, or excluding those who might benefit. In practical terms, you need to think carefully about the purpose of your project. You also need to consider the sample size and methods and the types of populations you're engaging with. You should be able to articulate the potential risks and benefits to these groups and guarantee their confidentiality while clearly communicating the limits of that confidentiality. Every participant should understand that the interview involves these risks and benefits, and they should understand how their data will be used, and critically, they should know that they can withdraw at any time. Let's turn now to some of the nuts and bolts of how to actually conduct a good interview. So start with your questions, moving from broad to specific and from simple to complex. This helps build rapport and allows participants to ease into more reflective or sensitive topics. For example, you might begin with, "Can you describe your role in this policy area?" before moving to, "What were the main sources of resistance to this policy?" Then you want to end on a neutral or reflective note. Think of something like, "Is there anything we haven't covered that you think is important?" This allows the interviewee to close more comfortably. Next, during the interview, active listening is key. Give respondents time to think, elaborate, and clarify. Use subtle verbal clues like nodding or saying things like, "I see," or "That's helpful." This shows engagement without steering the response. Finally, take good notes. Record as much detail as you can, ideally in real time. Immediately after the interview, review your notes to fill in gaps and ensure they're legible and complete. That step is crucial while the conversation is still fresh in your mind. Once your interviews are complete, the next stage is coding and analysis. This essentially makes sense of what you've heard. Here, Beamer outlines a structured five-step process. Begin by identifying any potential sources of bias or contamination, like interviewer effects, respondent motives, or interruptions that may have influenced responses. Next, define your keywords or phrases, linking them back to your core constructs such as feasibility, equity, or stakeholder influence, if that's what you're analyzing. Next, code your data, tracking the frequency or prominence of themes that arose during the conversation, while noting any interesting deviations. Then cross-check your findings with external sources such as reports, media coverage, or policy documents. These will help assess validity. Finally, aggregate your insights to draw broader inferences about the policy or political environment that you're studying, and this process ensures that your qualitative data isn't just anecdotal. Here is when it becomes systematic and analytically rigorous. One of the most widely used approaches for analyzing interview data is content analysis. It's a structured way of organizing qualitative data into categories or themes, and these allow you to interpret meaning in a clear, systematic way. The process typically involves several steps. First, read and then reread your transcripts until you are thoroughly familiar with them. Second, organize your data, and this might mean separating it by topic or respondent group. Third, identify themes that are exhaustive, mutually exclusive, and clearly defined. Then, assign these codes to your data and review them while you revise where necessary. After that, you can look for patterns such as areas of convergence or divergence. And finally, summarize your findings while being explicit about your limitations, including missing perspectives or contextual constraints. The point of content analysis isn't just to categorize information. It's to distill meaning and insight in a way that supports evidence-based policy conclusions. So now that we've covered key informant interviews, we're going to shift gears to the second major topic, equity assessment. Here, we will focus on how to integrate considerations of fairness and justice into policy analysis. Remember that equity assessment is not a side note, but a core dimension of evaluation. Before we get into equity as a general concept, it's important to distinguish between racial equity and racial justice. Racial equity, as defined by Race Forward, is about fair treatment. This fair treatment would lead to equitable opportunities and outcomes for all racial groups. It's about ensuring the systems and structures aren't perpetuating disparities. Racial justice, on the other hand, goes a step further. It's about transforming the conditions that created inequities in the first place. It is a situation in which race is no longer a reliable predictor of social outcomes like health, safety, or economic stability. In other words, racial equity is the goal and racial justice is the process, the work of changing institutions, policies, and power dynamics to make that goal achievable. There are also practical dimensions to how institutions pursue equity, and two common dimensions are workforce equity and contracting equity. Workforce equity refers to ensuring that the composition of a government or organizational workforce reflects the diversity of the population it serves. These are across all levels, from leadership to frontline roles. Meanwhile, contracting equity looks at how government resources are distributed, whether funding, contracts, and procurement opportunities are reaching communities of color equitably. This includes consultants, goods and services, and vendor relationships. Both dimensions of equity are concrete levers that institutions can use to embed racial equity into their operations, moving from principle to practice. And now that we've defined what racial equity and justice mean in principle, let's talk about how we actually assess public policies through that lens. The racial equity impact assessment is one of the most practical tools to do so. And as it's defined here, a racial equity impact assessment involves a conscious and careful analysis of how public decisions affect different racial and ethnic groups. The goal isn't just to document disparities, but to evaluate the actual or anticipated impacts of policies and budgets before and after implementation. It's both a diagnostic and a preventive tool. These help policymakers identify ways to maximize inclusion and minimize harm. You can think here of racial equity impact assessment as a form of equity due diligence, thereby ensuring that the effects of a policy are fair, equitable, and aligned with broader goals of social justice. When conducting a racial equity impact assessment, the first step is to analyze existing or current problems. This begins with identifying adverse effects, how current policies, practices, or spending patterns might disproportionately harm disadvantaged, racialized communities, and it could involve access to healthcare, education, housing, or even representation in policymaking spaces. Next, we need to unpack the causes and contributing factors behind these inequities. Often, the issue isn't an isolated bad policy, though sometimes it is, but it's usually a pattern of structural bias. Things like inequitable funding formulas, exclusionary eligibility criteria, or policies that seem neutral but have disparate impacts. Finally, assess what data and evidence exist and what's missing. Quantitative data can highlight disparities, but qualitative data from interviews or community consultations often provides the context needed to explain why these disparities persist. The diagnostic phase is essential. It frames the problem clearly so that any future policy proposals can address root causes and not just the symptoms. Next, once the existing problems are identified, the next step is to evaluate current or proposed policies through an equity lens. Here are some guiding questions from Keller's framework that you may pause and read. In this phase, it's not just about integrating an equity checkpoint into the policy cycle. It's about not waiting until after implementation to discover inequitable outcomes. When designing new policies, programs, or budgets, the same principles really apply, but here the focus is on building equity from the start. First, ensure meaningful participation from those most affected by inequity. Community engagement shouldn't be symbolic. It should shape problem definition, design, and evaluation. Here we also pull from the HIV/AIDS experience. The meaningful involvement of people with HIV/AIDS policy is applicable not just to people living with HIV, but to people of all communities. It means involving them from the start until the end. And here are some questions that you can use to help you during this process. So during this stage, we're moving from critique to creation, from identifying inequities to proposing concrete, feasible solutions. In this framework, which was adapted from the Food System Racial Equity Assessment tool and uses health system in place of the food system, provides a holistic way to structure an equity assessment around 4 dimensions: people, place, process, and power. Under people, we ask who benefits and who is burdened by this policy, as well as who may be missing from the conversation. Place examines the geographical context, which communities are affected, and how do structural barriers shape access to opportunities. Process focuses on inclusion and transparency. Are decision-making processes fair, and do they integrate equity considerations meaningfully? And then power asks the hardest but most essential question: who holds influence and who's excluded from holding influence, and how can that power imbalance be shifted? Together, these dimensions help us examine not just what a policy does, but how it operates within a broader system of inequities. When used thoughtfully, this tool turns equity from an abstract value into a concrete analytic and planning practice. Next, the City of Seattle has a race and social justice initiative, and it follows 6 key steps, which we will walk through now. But before getting into that, we must understand what racism means as part of racial equity analysis. So it's a form of oppression based on race, but unlike simple discrimination, racism involves power and structure. Who has the ability to shape systems and who is systematically disadvantaged by them. And in the case of racism, um, white supremacy sits at the top and aims to disadvantage those who are not white. We can think of it across 4 dimensions: interpersonal racism, which shows up in everyday prejudice or discriminatory acts between individuals; institutional racism, which is embedded in the policies and practices of organizations that advantage one group while disadvantage others, even if this is unintentional; structural racism, which occurs when the cumulative effects of institutional policies and historical inequities overlap across systems. This is inclusive of housing, health, and education, for example. And then there's internalized racism, where individuals may absorb and reproduce negative stereotypes about their own racial or ethnic group. A good racial equity analysis makes all of these layers visible, so we can then identify not just symptoms, but systems that create and sustain inequity. The first step in racial equity analysis is to set outcomes, defining the specific equity goals that your policy or program wants to achieve. And you can ask yourself, what are the most important outcomes from a racial equity standpoint? Which opportunities will be most effective? And what existing strengths or challenges can either support or hinder the process. This stage establishes your direction. It's about being clear on what success looks like, not just in abstract terms, but in measurable, community-defined outcomes. The second step is about inclusion and evidence. You start by identifying which communities or geographic areas are most affected and gather demographic data to understand why. But numbers alone aren't enough. You also need community voices. Who are the stakeholders most directly affected, and how are they involved in shaping the analysis? Your goal here is to uncover root causes of inequity, not just who is impacted, but why. That means analyzing both quantitative and qualitative insights, like local narratives or historical context. When done well, this step shifts the analysis from being about communities to being driven by communities. Step 3 is where the analysis becomes evaluative. You identify the benefits and burdens of the policy. You may ask, will it increase or decrease racial equity? What are the possible unintended consequences? And how do these effects align with the outcomes that I defined earlier? Then, step 4 moves you toward action. Develop strategies to advance opportunity or to minimize harm. Here, you may think in both the short and long term. What can you do immediately to mitigate inequitable effects? And then, what structural changes could promote lasting equity? Remember that equity work is iterative. If your results aren't aligning with community-defined goals, then you can revisit and realign your strategy. That responsiveness is what distinguishes equity analysis from static evaluation. Then, step 5 is about evaluation and accountability. How will you track progress over time? What's your goal and timeline for reducing inequities? And how will you maintain stakeholder engagement by ensuring transparency and continuous learning? Then in step 6, you report back. This means sharing findings and next steps with the community, their leadership, and anyone affected by the policy. Closing the loop is a critical step. It demonstrates integrity, builds trust, and ensures that equity assessment isn't performative. It's participatory and accountable. So to wrap up, let's connect back to the broader framework from Patton, Sawicki, and Clark. When integrating equity into policy analysis, we can ask questions like what are the causes of structural factors driving inequitable outcomes? How do these relate to the social and political determinants of health? Who is most affected and why? Or what policy options exist to address the issue already and what evidence supports their effectiveness? These questions push us to make equity not just a value, but a benchmark for evaluating the quality of the policy itself. So thank you for your attention and engagement with this topic. We've covered a lot of ground, from how to collect and interpret qualitative data through key informant interviews to how to integrate equity analysis into the policy process. Next week, we will consider cost-benefit and cost-effectiveness analyses.